Hey everybody, I'm Dan Murrell, and this is my review of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is hitting theaters in North America this Friday. And if you hear any spooky sounds during this review, it's the construction ghosts right outside the studio banging on the walls, begging to be let in. Not really, but there's definitely construction happening, so pardon their dust. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is an adaptation of 3 books that were keystones for a certain generation, my generation mostly, that were published from 1981 to 1991. These books were written by Alvin Schwartz, but the thing that really sticks in a lot of people's minds, including mine, were the illustrations, which were done by Stephen Gammell. As a matter of fact, these books were hugely controversial at the time, especially in the 80s when the whole satanic panic thing was going on. The fact that these illustrations were so gruesome and that these stories were very dark, often brutal stories, caused a lot of controversy, but also stuck in a lot of people's minds. One person whose mind it obviously stuck in was Guillermo del Toro, who produced this film. It's directed by Andre Overdahl, who you might have seen is a director that's done films like Troll Hunter and The Autopsy of Jane Doe. But I think the real draw here is that sort of creepy, almost gothic horror feel that Guillermo del Toro and the design team behind this movie have really been putting at the forefront. And creepy imagery has always been at the forefront of this particular collection of stories. Now, what the movie Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark does is frame all of this in a town called Mill Valley in 1968. The whole movie plays against the backdrop of Vietnam, of the 1968 Richard Nixon presidential election. And it's like there's an attempt to tie that in, but not really, because what the movie is actually about is all of these sequences. They're rough adaptations of some of the stories that you find in these 3 books. And what I have to weigh when I'm trying to decide what I thought of the movie was how effective those sequences are versus how effective the rest of the movies are. The rest of the movie's design, the rest of the plot, the rest of the story. It's a very loose structure as far as the scary stories themselves go. We're introduced to, of course, the local town ghost, a woman named Sarah Bellows, who rumor has it if you go to her haunted house will tell you scary stories in the dark. We're introduced to an enchanted book that writes the scary stories, but the twist is that they actually come true in the real world. And that's actually not a terrible concept for the film. It's a little bit similar to what we saw with Goosebumps, with the R.L. Stine series, but it's not. This movie is not at all like those films. Those films were very much horror light for a much younger audience. And there's been a lot of hype about this movie that it's intended to introduce the horror genre to a young audience. But I would caution severely that this movie is not for kids. Even though it is a PG-13 rating, this is a straight up horror movie. There are no bumpers on the gutters like you would find in a bowling alley for kids. This is a straight up horror movie. As a matter of fact, there was a dad who had brought a couple of kids at the screening that I went to last night that were probably about 10 years old. They left because I think the movie was even too intense for them. So this movie is definitely not for young kids. And I think even as you get into the 10, 11, or 12 age range, you really are going to have to judge it by, if you're taking your kids, by how affected they are by horror movies, because this is not horror light. This is a horror movie aimed at a teen audience. I think that because of that, there are certain things that are done with the story that kind of have I've seen it all type thing to people that have been watching horror movies for a very long time. Obviously, I watch a bunch of movies because of my job. I like the novelty of the idea of this book of mythological stories that come true as they're being written, but it was grafted onto a story that's been done in a lot of horror franchises before in so many different ways. The idea of a vengeful spirit out for revenge against the living, and a group of young people who are out to clear the spirit's name and stop the curse. There's not much original in that concept. So there's that, which I didn't really like that much, versus some genuinely creepy imagery, some creepy sequences, some great design work capitalizing on all of that artwork that really stuck this horror series in so many people's brains, including mine, mind when they were kids and introducing that to a new generation. And it really is weighing those two things against each other and deciding which one wins out. Because there are some legitimately creepy moments, some things that you will think about. There are some great monster and creature designs. There's a scarecrow. There's, of course, the big smiling lady that has been a big part of the marketing for this. There's some creepy body horror. There are a lot of genuinely effective horror sequences inside this movie. But ultimately, for me, despite some masterful creepy touches, there's just not quite enough actual scary for me to justify the tired story. That's not going to be the case for everybody. This has been a recurring thing for me with horror films is I love a good scare, but for me, there has to be a little bit extra there for me. And honestly, if the movie had sustained the number of creepy sequences throughout the film, I probably would have recommended it. And I'm very borderline on it as it stands because there really is some good stuff there, particularly for horror fans. However, I felt like the last half hour really dove headfirst into just a very conventional type of horror ending. All of the innovation that had been done in the sequences before that, I thought really just weren't there in the last 30 minutes or so of the movie. And I think that was the thing that tipped me over to saying it's not quite a movie that I would recommend. However, I will caveat that with the fact that there are definitely some effective and creepy sequences. I wouldn't discourage you from going to see it, particularly if you're a fan of the genre. I would discourage you from taking very young children to see it, or at least if you are, knowing that it is going to be a very scary movie. This is not Goosebumps. This is not werewolves running around or even the creepy ventriloquist dummies. These are hardcore horror monsters, and at times they really do take this PG-13 rating right up to the limit. So know that going in. And even though it's not quite enough for me to recommend, I do think that there are a lot of horror fans out there and a lot of Guillermo del Toro fans out there that are really going to dig the aesthetics of this movie and may very well have a good time. So that's my review of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Did you see it? What did you think? Should this movie have come out on Halloween? I kind of think it should have, especially considering that we're in the midst of the summer movie season and there's so many other movies that are coming out this week. Was it enough to stand out from the pack for you? Let me know down in the comments below as always. And please stay tuned here to Fandom Entertainment. We'll be covering the latest movie news. We'll be doing reviews and everything else all throughout the year. Try to stay safe. I'm going to run from the construction ghosts and we'll see you next time.